This program contains dramatizations of real events and violent content. Viewer discretion is advised. Mother's Day 2005. The sound of a single gunshot sails through the Lawton, Oklahoma night.
Lawton Fort 911.
My little brother just shot himself in the head.
The scene is ghastly. The victim unrecognizable.
The whole side of his head was completely just blown away.
The victim's brother is charged with murder.
Gregory Morick was the killer.
But things aren't always as they seem.
The police investigation in this case was not done well, and it was never completed.
Now, two teams of experts will go head-to-head.
I've never had a case that strictly boiled down to battle of the experts.
To determine whether this is a case of fraternal homicide.
The person wearing the shirt has to have been standing directly behind Peter Morick.
Or tragic suicide.
There was a question based upon bloodstains.
Coming up on Forensics, You Decide. The sun has long since set in Lawton, Oklahoma, and most of this town is tucked away for the night. It's shortly after midnight when a desperate call comes in to 911.
Lawton Fort 911.
My little brother just shot himself in the head.
Lawton police officer Luis Alvarez is one of the first to receive the call from dispatch.
It came out as a possible suicide. Not too often you get phone calls saying somebody shot themselves in the head.
Officer Alvarez arrives at the scene and immediately sees the caller, Greg Morick.
When I first arrived, I observed Mr. Morick at the front porch of the residence, sitting down. He was only in his boxer shorts, didn't have a shirt on. He had an alcoholic beverage in his hand, and he was chain smoking. He was pretty upset.
Alvarez enters the house and is met by a grisly scene.
Whenever I first saw the victim, Peter, he was lying on his back. He had an apparent gunshot wound to the head. His head was split open.
It is obvious to the young officer that 44-year-old Peter Morick is dead.
It was overwhelming to see the damage that was done to him.
Investigators Chuck Miller and Tommy Harrell are called to the scene, as is standard procedure. And Harrell is immediately drawn to a key piece of evidence: the gun that presumably killed Peter.
That gun was a .50 caliber Desert Eagle semi-automatic. It's a very, very large handgun.
It's not the gun itself that troubles this seasoned investigator, but where he finds it.
When I first saw the gun, it was about 6 feet away from where the shooting occurred, and the gun was laying on top of this table. That would be really unusual for a reported suicide.
And detectives find another clue left behind by the victim's brother.
Greg said that he was wearing a white T-shirt at the time that he had taken off and left in a chair. We got that shirt, and upon examining, there were a lot of bloodstains on that shirt.
The team senses there may be more to this story than suicide.
It struck me as just very, very odd with his demeanor, him kicked back in a lawn chair, smoking a cigarette, drinking a drink, and it was like no big deal to him.
And an on-the-spot examination of the weapon raises even more questions.
I could see the Desert Eagle gun laying on the computer desk with the hammer cocked, but one thing that was extremely troubling to me was the gun was on safe.
That .50 caliber firearm's got a lever on the side of it. It literally has to be pulled back down to engage the safety. The chances of this gun re-engaging the safety on its own were very, very slim, if at all.
Investigators reason someone must have re-engaged the safety after the gun was fired.
Physically, from the devastation that Peter had, there is no way that Peter could have been holding that gun, put that gun on safe, and then threw the gun before he hit the floor. It's physically impossible.
Greg, the only other person in the room that night, has some serious explaining to do.
I instructed Officer Alvarez to transport Greg Morick to the station for a formal interview. Do you mind if I call you Greg?
You call me Greg.
Later that night, a stunned Greg Morick faces an intense interrogation.
I was terrified. I said this was not a crime, it was a suicide.
But investigators aren't so sure. They press Greg for his version of what happened that night.
Pete would come up quite often from Wichita Falls, Texas, and he would help me with projects around the house.
Some nights, Peter would stay with Greg when he didn't want to drive the 60 miles home. But this night wasn't supposed to be one of them.
Pete suddenly showed up in the office where I had the computer. I was startled. I didn't expect him.
Greg admits to investigators that he and his brother fought, but says it didn't last long.
After our disagreement, Pete had gone out to his pickup truck, and I was trying to avoid him. And he came back into the house with a very large pistol.
Paralyzed with fear, Greg says he remained at his computer.
I was on the computer and he set it down right there.
I begged him, please, don't put the pistol to your head.
Greg describes how the next deadly moments played out.
And he picked up that pistol and he shot himself. He did it right in front of me. He wanted me to see him.
But if Peter's death is a suicide, how did his gun end up on Greg's desk?
I know what you're thinking, or why that pistol was on the desk.
After Pete shot himself, the recoil of the pistol had jerked his hand away, and the gun was ejected from his hand.
I saw a pistol fly by and I went like that.
It had flown in front of me and hit the desk.
To investigators, the story reeks of suspicion.
When he made the statement that when he heard the shot go off and then the gun flew in front of him and landed on the desk, one of my questions to Greg was, I said, well, how did the gun get on safe?
I can't really answer that exactly.
It became pretty clear that Peter did not shoot himself. He was shot by someone else. There was only one other person there, and that was his brother Greg.
On Mother's Day 2005, Greg Morick is arrested for his brother's murder.
Evidence showed that there was enough probable cause to believe that, one, Peter was shot by someone else, and that Greg's the one that shot him.
But probable cause won't cut it for Comanche County Assistant DA Bill Riley.
We have no eyewitnesses. We have no conclusive evidence to indicate what happened.
Riley knows this case will boil down to one key ingredient.
We had to rely on the forensic evidence to prove that death was not suicide, but it was caused by Gregory Morick.
Bill Riley plans to prove Greg's guilt one piece of evidence at a time, starting with Peter's autopsy.
The skull was open, damaged.
When medical examiner Dr. Jeffrey Gofton examines the body, he finds the first clue the prosecution needs.
There's no injuries on his hands. There's no soot deposits, visible soot deposits on his hands that would indicate that the weapon was in his hand.
To Dr. Gofton, this suggests Peter wasn't holding the gun during the shooting. It's a serious strike against Greg. Next, Dr. Gofton examines the bullet wound itself.
In this case, there was dense soot deposits at the site or at the point of entry, along with tissue undermining. And both of those two elements indicate that this was a contact gunshot wound.
But it's the bullet's point of entry that stuns the doctor.
The projectile or bullet entered right at the back of the head. An entrance wound at the back of the head in a suicide case is extremely unusual.
And when the doctor considers the gun in this case, the story of suicide makes even less sense.
The .50 caliber Desert Eagle pistol is a very unwieldy weapon. It has a longer barrel. It has a very heavy weight to it. It'd be very awkward to put into a position at the back of one's head.
Awkward or impossible? From the bullet hole found in the door frame, investigators have determined the bullet's path.
The trajectory is up out of the left side of his head.
Investigators are also able to determine how the gun was positioned.
This is the trajectory that the bullet went through his head at. Now you try to reach back and put your hand on the grip of the gun.
Okay. There's no way I can get my arm back there. The gun's too long.
And that's the big problem with the story.
And this leads Dr. Gofton to his final conclusion.
It was my opinion this case represented a homicide.
But even if Peter Morick didn't shoot himself, that doesn't prove Greg Morick did. But still, more evidence just might.
We had to take a real strong look at the blood evidence. That had probably the most telling evidence of anything that was in the scene.
Investigator Harrell calls on the help of Special Agent Iris Daly.
Iris Daly, who is a crime scene investigator and reconstructionist and a bloodstain analyst, is one of the most respected in the state when it comes to those disciplines.
And Agent Daly knows the blood spatter will be critical in determining what really happened that night.
I wanted to see if I could determine what had occurred, such as his position, patterns that would indicate who may or may not have held the gun at the time that the shot was fired. You have this V-shaped pattern coming all the way across here.
Daly starts by focusing on Greg Morick's bloody T-shirt found at the scene.
This is really the more significant, is these tiny stains here. Pretty heavy concentration of these misted-like stains. These, they're about the width of a single thread.
To Special Agent Daly,
Just look over here on this side.
the size of the bloodstains is critical in this case.
Because of that small size, those drops are known not to travel very far. So to be that close together, we're not talking very far from that source.
Right.
That size of blood drop will only travel in the air up to about 2 feet. And it all comes back to a source above that left shoulder.
But would the larger caliber weapon used in this shooting cause the blood to travel farther than 2 feet?
The bloodstains from a gunshot wound are going to travel the same distance in terms of those tiny mist-like stains, because the physics of those particular stains doesn't change by the caliber of the projectile. The caliber of the gun will make a difference in that the larger the volume of blood, the more blood stains you'll have.
And to Daly, the tiny stains on Greg Morick's T-shirt suggest a specific scenario.
If we find those stains, as I did on the right shoulder of this T-shirt, then that would indicate that that right shoulder could not have been more than about 2 feet from the wound at the time the wound occurred.
Daly suits up and takes to the shooting range, putting her theory to the test.
The purpose of this demonstration is to try to simulate what happens when you have a contact wound into bloody tissue.
She uses chicken livers and real human blood as her target.
And I will shoot one contact shot into my blood source.
One shot, and the blood and tissue fly.
When we look at those tiny stains, we'll actually begin to see a dispersion pattern similar to the right shoulder of the T-shirt in question. Not the large stains, but those that are very tiny, 1 millimeter in diameter or less. And we see them here close to the source, but as we move away, the few that show up are very dispersed. We see larger stains, we don't see the tiny stains farther away.
And the blood pattern on Daly's arms tells another story.
You can see that there are tiny blood spatters across the tops of both arms. This would be consistent with the stain patterns across the T-shirt, particularly across the back and the right shoulder.
For Daly, this is the confirmation she needs.
This is indication that the right shoulder of that shirt was 18 inches to 2 feet from the blood source at the time that those blood stains occurred.
The new evidence is damning to Greg's claim that he was sitting at his desk 6 feet away from Peter during the shooting.
I would say it's not possible for the person wearing that shirt to have been standing at a greater distance than 2 feet from the back of Peter Morick at the time that Peter Morick was shot.
There is one last piece of the forensic puzzle that needs to be explained.
Greg said when the shot went off, he looked to his left. This gun twirls around in front of him, falls down on a counter with the hammer back and the safety on.
I think it hit the desk on his way down.
To investigators, Greg's story is highly implausible.
That safety is designed to be pushed back into position, not something that would just occur on its own.
And it takes some force to push that up off a safe.
Investigators play out the only scenarios that can possibly explain how the safety re-engaged.
Right, there's only two ways for that gun to get back on safe. One, it had to come in contact with something to push it back down, or two, it had to be pushed back on safe by someone else.
Based on the crime scene and Greg's desk, Harrell rules out scenario number one.
There was absolutely no evidence at the scene that this gun came in contact with anything that would push that safety back on.
And this leaves investigators with only one viable explanation.
That means this gun had to have been pushed back on safe by someone else, and Greg was the only other one there that could have done it.
If Harrell is right, it will seal the case against Greg Morick. Now, he needs to test his theory.
We built a stand to hold the gun up. We run a string through the trigger so that it could be fired unsupported.
In a series of dramatic tests, investigators find the one crucial answer they are looking for.
The safety never re-engaged itself. It was always off, no matter what you did to it.
The findings are yet another blow to Greg's account of the shooting.
What we concluded from this test, along with the other physical evidence, is that this gun did not fly across the room, land on the desk, and engage the safety. This gun was placed on safe, laid on the desk by someone else, and Greg was the only other one there that could have done it.
It looks like a solid case, but the lingering question remains. Why would Greg Morick shoot and kill his only brother?
Obviously, in a murder case, the jurors want to be able to understand why it happened.
Investigators know Peter's drinking caused a world of tension between the Morick brothers, and the night Peter died was no exception.
And that led into another argument like they always got into when Peter was drinking.
But investigators believe this argument took a deadly twist when Peter pulled out a gun.
I really think that it startled Greg.
I think something snapped in Gregory, and I think he picked up the gun and shot Peter in the back of the head.
And that, the prosecution says, spells first-degree murder.
You can form premeditation in an instant, and I think that's what happened here.
Months of investigating have come to an end, and now the prosecution believes it has developed a clear picture of how Peter Morick's shooting really played out.
I think that Greg Morick was indeed at the computer desk, and I think that Peter was probably beating on a door, and Greg knew who it was, knew that Peter was drinking.
He said to Peter, "You're a real when you're drunk." Peter left the room, came back shortly thereafter, had the gun in his hand, was playing with the gun, set it down on the desk.
And I think Greg was scared to death of Peter, and that he knew that if Peter picked that gun back up, Peter would probably do something stupid with that gun. And I think out of just a split reaction, he picked the gun up, grabbed Peter by the hair, jammed the gun in his neck, and fired the round.
What I believe is that Greg re-engaged the safety, laid the gun on the desk, and for whatever reason took his shirt off and put it in the chair, and then called the police.
Not reports to 911.
My little brother.
With science on their side, prosecutors are confident in their case against Greg.
The evidence that we have that points to Gregory Morick is scientific stuff.
An entrance wound at the back of the head in a suicide case is extremely unusual.
Someone was standing behind Peter at the time that he was wounded.
This gun had to have been pushed back on safe by someone else.
This was definitely homicide.
But there is another side to this deadly story. Defense attorney Debbie Maddox is at the ready, determined to prove investigators dead wrong.
If you go into a scene and you decide that you're going to find a murder, guess what? You're going to find a murder every single time. I never even thought for a second that he had committed this crime. Never. As a criminal defense lawyer, it was nothing short of outrageous.
Debbie Maddox isn't alone. No one is more convinced of Greg's innocence than his sister, Marta Moore.
Ultimately, I believed in my heart that Pete had done something to himself and that Greg was not involved in it in any way except being at the wrong place.
After talking to the Morrick family, Maddox believes prosecutors ignored the most obvious scenario in Peter's shooting.
They never, ever looked into the suicide option.
But if Peter did commit suicide, the defense must prove he had the mindset to do so.
The drugs had gotten so bad that to save his life, he had to go into rehab.
And from all accounts, Peter had been drinking heavily the night of the shooting.
Greg knows immediately that he was extremely drunk, incredibly drunk. When we got the medical examiner's report, in Oklahoma, the back page is the toxicology page, and it showed that Peter had a .30 blood alcohol level. That is almost 4 times the legal limit.
And the defense contends this led to a dangerous state of mind.
Peter was unable to respond in a rational way. Peter was talking about wanting to die. Peter was talking about how he was going to kill himself.
But did Peter have reason to actually follow through on his threats? The defense turns to Dr. Tim Proctor to answer that question.
A psychological autopsy is simply an analysis of the person's life, both throughout their life and in particular just before they died.
Dr. Proctor commences the autopsy by determining Peter Morrick's risk level for suicide.
What I did was, first of all, reviewed all available records that I had, and then I spoke with several key individuals in his life.
Through the process, Proctor hears about a series of major losses in Peter's life.
Both his mother and father developed cancer. They died, and his estranged girlfriend died of mysterious circumstances. I believe he was very distraught from the cumulative loss over the course of a 9-month period.
Once his girlfriend died, it was over. And he just said, Marta, I don't want to live anymore. Everybody I love is dead.
He had lived a pretty unstable life and had struggled throughout his life.
Dr. Proctor starts adding up the list of suicide risks.
The first one is the fact that he was a male. Second is third. Sixth is the family history. 9, an easy access to lethal means, experiencing a great deal of debt. 15, 16, 17, hopelessness. And the last thing is the strong feeling of guilt about his estranged girlfriend's death. This list of risk factors is much higher than what you would expect in a typical person.
The high number leads Dr. Proctor to just one conclusion.
At the time of his death, Peter was at a very high risk for suicide.
It's a critical piece of the defense's case.
I mean, it was just nothing less than stunning because it kind of put it into perspective about how awful Peter Morrick's life was.
But just because Peter was a high suicide risk doesn't mean Greg is innocent of murder. To prove that, defense attorney Maddox needs to go one step further.
I had to answer all of the scientific concerns in the case.
The prosecution has used science to paint a picture of murder.
Those bloodstains were consistent with someone wearing this shirt standing behind Peter Morrick at the time that that wound occurred.
Now experts for the defense are about to examine the same blood evidence and come to vastly different conclusions.
It is, without question, the most critical piece of scientific evidence.
So Maddox turns to forensic scientist Ed Hieskey.
There was a question from the very beginning as to the position Gregory was in based upon blood stains.
The prosecution claims the small stains are inconsistent with someone sitting 6 feet away from the shooting.
This is an indication that the right shoulder of that shirt was 18 inches to 2 feet from the blood source at the time that those blood stains occurred.
In theory, Hieskey agrees with the prosecution.
Historically, 3 or 4 feet is about as far as we've found that to travel.
But because of the extremely powerful weapon used to kill Peter, Hieskey claims this theory doesn't apply here.
Namely a .50 caliber. And we have, in effect, an explosion, literally causing his head to explode and brain tissue and scalp flying all over the room.
And Hieskey believes the explosion helps account for the tiny blood stains that appeared on Greg's shirt, even at a distance of 6 feet.
When you have bloody tissue flying through the air, some of this blood will come off in flight, and it will give the appearance of blood that would have to have resulted from a close-range shot. Suddenly, these tiny droplets can go much further than physics would allow.
To support his theory, Hieskey points to 2 chairs from the scene.
I was very surprised when I inspected those to see little stains that appeared to be blood.
The chairs were another several feet beyond where Greg claimed to be sitting during the shooting.
They have blood stains that are very small, and you cannot ignore those.
Now Hieskey turns to the chair Greg claimed to be seated in at the time of the shooting.
I was not able to find any blood anywhere on either side of the cushion.
It's a small but critical detail.
He's seated on the cushion. No blood goes on the cushion. No blood goes on the parts of the chair that are covered by his body, namely the back of the chair and the right side.
The lack of blood on the cushion tells Hieskey one thing.
I found it to be entirely consistent with Greg having been seated there.
And if Greg was seated in the chair, he couldn't have stood behind his brother and pulled the trigger.
Everything is clearly consistent with Greg's statements and inconsistent with the prosecution.
The defense believes it has successfully established Peter Morick as a man on the edge.
Peter was at a very high risk for suicide, in my opinion.
But if defense attorney Debbie Maddox intends to win her case, she must confront the prosecution's most incriminating piece of evidence.
This gun did not fly across the room, land on the desk, and engage the safety. This gun was placed on safe, laid on the desk by someone else, and Greg was the only other one there that could have done it.
It seems an insurmountable detail, but Debbie Maddox believes in her client.
When the safety was engaged, of course, the next thing that I did is ask Greg Morick, did you touch the gun? And he said, no, I'm afraid of guns. They scare me to death.
So how else could the safety have re-engaged?
I called Ed Hieskey, and I said, is it unheard of that a safety would engage on its own?
Forensic expert Ed Hieskey begins by examining the gun used to kill Peter Morick.
That safety, if you gave a little pressure to it, it kind of snapped in position. So then I started considering the possibility, simple impact with any of the objects on the table, or maybe even the table itself.
Next, Hieskey scrutinizes the crime scene photos looking for any potential clues.
I noticed that there were a number of things. There was the desk pad, a mouse cord, and then there were several ballpoint pens there.
Hieskey believes he may be looking at a critical piece of evidence.
And I thought, well, I wonder if something as simple as a ballpoint pen, if the gun happened to land just right, if that could produce movement of the safety.
Using his own weapon, Hieskey reconstructs his original test with Peter's gun.
All I had to do with the actual gun and pin is set it up just like that. If it rotates towards the table from that position, the safety would pop on the actual gun.
Hieskey takes this one step further by demonstrating a possible scenario the night of the shooting.
It certainly would be highly likely the gun would fly out of the hand and land and perhaps hitting the edge of the mouse pad, causing the safety to go on, and then the gun winds up in that position.
It's a decisive moment for the defense.
Ed found that that safety did engage with much greater ease than Lawton Police Department had ever entertained. Guns do crazy things. That's what makes them dangerous.
The gun safety is a breakthrough for the defense. But one last piece of the puzzle must fit. The gunshot to the back of Peter's head.
There's no way I can get my hand back there. It's physically impossible for me to get my hand back there with that large of a gun.
The state certainly made a big deal about it. They kept suggesting that his hand had to come back here and that his head had to be like this, or detective, maybe he just turned his head.
Could it be that simple?
There's no way I can get my hand back there.
When the Morick family reveals the dramatic details about another brother, Peter's suicide seems to make perfect sense.
I had an older brother, and he and Pete were very close. Michael had also committed suicide by shooting himself.
But it's the way Michael shot himself that completes this story for the defense.
Michael's was in the back of the head. It seems striking that he ultimately dies with the same type of wound using a handgun, and that it is so similar.
Peter's suicide is the mirror image of his brother Michael's.
Pete was quoted saying to other family members, Mike did it the right way. Is it a coincidence that he did it in the same way? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. In this case, I don't think it is.
It's a dramatic revelation and the final piece to Greg Morick's defense.
Peter Morick had a motive. He was miserable and very desperate.
Debbie Maddox believes Peter Morick's death is a classic suicide.
This is a man that wanted to die. He had a big gun and he knew how to shoot it. He put a gun to the back of his head and he pulled the trigger.
Just like his brother. Finally, after a thorough investigation, the defense has painted a distinct picture of how that fateful night played out.
Around midnight, Greg hears the back door of the home open and Pete comes through. It was obvious that his brother Peter was drunk, and as Pete left the room, Greg says to him, "Has anyone told you that you're when you're drinking?" Shortly after that brief interaction, Peter comes back into the room. He's got the .50 caliber handgun, and he looks at Greg. He turns his back to Greg, and he blows his head off with the handgun.
The gun would fly out of the hand and land, perhaps hitting the edge of the mouse pad, causing the safety to go on.
Anything can happen with a gun, and there will be no way that I can explain it or anyone else can explain it.
The defense has made its case and believes science is on its side, starting with Peter's psychological autopsy.
Peter was at a very high risk for suicide.
And the blood evidence found at the scene.
There was no blood on the cushion.
And finally, its theory about the gun's safety re-engaging.
The safety would pop on the actual gun.
For the defense, all this makes for an open and shut case.
Ultimately, I think all of the evidence proved Peter Morick's desperation and grief. And there was a lot of evidence that we talked about, a lot of scientific evidence.
But the prosecution stands by its evidence. And experts, portraying Greg Morick as a cold-blooded killer, not a grieving brother.
The forensics evidence was strong enough, and if it was not a suicide, then it had to be a homicide, a first-degree murder.
In January 2008, Greg Morick stands trial for the murder of his brother Peter. For defense attorney Debbie Maddox, the pressure is intense.
You don't stop and you don't think about it and you don't dwell on it. There's no considering losing this case, we just can't.
Emotions run high on both sides of the courtroom.
I'm always nervous when a case begins. You hope that you've done all the preparation that you need. Once it starts, you kind of lose all that and you get wrapped up in what you're doing.
The trial is one of the most contentious in recent history here.
I've never had a case that strictly boiled down to battle of the experts.
The prosecution is prepared to fight.
From my analysis, I'm convinced that Peter Morick did not kill himself. And I would say that the testimony that I heard from the defense expert was not consistent with the evidence that I examined.
To jurors, the prosecution's experts are convincing.
After Iris Daly presented her evidence, I was leaning more towards, okay, yeah, possibly he could have done this.
But the defense is equally prepared for the courtroom battle.
We got blood traveling a whole lot more than 2 or 3 feet. How about 9, 10, 11 feet?
Do you believe the prosecution's forensic scientist, or do you believe the defense's forensic scientist?
The trial lasts just a week. Having heard both sides, the jurors must now decide Greg Morick's guilt or innocence.
And we went back into the deliberation room, and each of us went back around and explained why we felt guilty or not guilty.
The tension in the courtroom is palpable.
It's kind of like waiting for a baby to be born. You know, if you're an expectant father, you pace, you wonder what's going on behind those doors.
And you remember certain things, maybe I should have said this, maybe I should have done that.
I don't think anybody can tell you that they knew what that jury was going to do.
The jury deliberates just 3 hours before coming back with a unanimous decision.
Not guilty.
It took about 3 seconds, and I was just overwhelmed with joy.
I probably had to tell myself to take a breath, take a breath. And as I was looking over at Greg, I saw him mouth to the jurors, "Thank you."
The tears that have been saved up for 2.5 years while waiting for that trial just came flowing out.
The defense has prevailed in a hard-fought battle.
It's actually pretty rare in a defense case that the defense can answer every single concern raised by the state. But here we were able to do it.
But for prosecutors, the verdict is a resounding defeat.
I was disappointed. I thought we had a strong enough case to get a conviction.
But an Oklahoma jury didn't agree.
One of the biggest questions that I had was the lack of blood on the chair cushion, also the staining of the shirt, the white t-shirt with the blood stains, and there was no reason for Greg to kill Peter.
They found him not guilty. Finally, somebody was on our side.
Based on the forensic evidence, an Oklahoma jury agreed that Greg Morick is an innocent man. What did you decide?